The word is slavery, S-L-A-V-E-R-Y. Slavery has existed since human civilization has existed. It's been around for thousands of years. It's there in the Bible. Greeks took war slaves, of course. As long as there have been people trying to make a profit, there have been people trying to make a profit off the free labor, the exploited labor of other people. I write and I teach about slavery here at Nottingham, both two different kinds of slavery, really. The 19th century form, the historical form that we're probably more familiar with from history, where Africans are trafficked through the Middle Passage into the British colonies, into the American colonies, and then after the American Revolution, into the American South. And then the other form of slavery I write about is contemporary slavery, slavery in today's world, and I often teach and write about these two forms of slavery together. They are quite different. Slavery does still exist. There are 27 million people enslaved around the world today. It's a number that's been accepted by the United Nations, by the US State Department, by the British government. It includes slaves in South Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and 50,000 people enslaved within the US, according to the US State Department. This form of slavery, as we define it as people who are forced to work for no pay, against their will, who cannot walk away. So this is slavery as it's always been, a situation of forced labour, of economic exploitation, exploitation often achieved through violence or sometimes the threat of violence. But when we look at these situations and when I work with NGOs and with policymakers on how to free slaves, the basic question that we come back to when we look at a situation is, can this person walk away? And chances are, if they can't, then there's a relationship of slavery at the heart of this situation. There are differences, though, between this form of slavery, as we sort of use that word nowadays, and how 19th century Americans and Brits would have understood the word. So slavery is no longer racialized, for example, as it was in the 18th, 19th century slave trade. It can sometimes look as though slavery is racialized nowadays, but that's because people who are marginalized within their communities, the sort of ethnic minorities, the lower caste members in India, for example, the tribal members in Thailand, the tribal sort of hill people, those are the people who are the most vulnerable. Those are the people on whom traffickers and enslavers will prey. And then, of course, another big difference is about ownership. So in the 18th and 19th century, in the British colonies, in the American South, slave owners asserted their ownership through documentation. They had bills of sale. There was a sort of legal ownership. Slavery is obviously illegal everywhere now, although it happens on every continent. So people no longer try to assert ownership. We instead talk about slave holders or slavers or traffickers, but no longer about slave owners. And then one final difference is that it's no longer a lifelong situation. In the 19th century, you were born into bondage. It was hereditary. And there is still hereditary slavery today. It exists in Mauritania and in Sudan. But most of the world's slaves might be enslaved for between 3 to 7 years. It's a situation where you go through a process of enslavement. You're not born into slavery in the same way anymore. So there are these differences that it's important to keep in mind. Sometimes because of these differences, the word is sometimes a hard one. I've noticed, especially for Americans, to use. They're quite invested in one particular kind of slavery, and it, for them, means the racialized form. And so when slavery isn't sort of black Africans laboring in a cotton field in Mississippi, to them it can't be slavery. It's because they like to think that the Emancipation Proclamation, that the freeing of the slaves in the 1860s marked a big before and after. It was whatever Americans had done wrong in their history, at least they freed the slaves, at least Lincoln did right. All of that erases what happened after the Civil War. So the challenge there with policy, with getting funding for anti-slavery organizations, has been asking people not to talk about slave-like practices, not to talk about sort of abusive labor, but actually to use the word slavery. And there we've actually taken our lead from former slaves themselves. They describe a situation where they're paid nothing, held against their will, physically restrained from walking away, where they have no choice, no freedom of movement. So it's been helpful actually to take a step back from the sort of debate about the word and whether we can use it and whether it's offensive to use it, because it minimizes the power of the historical word somehow. People are more familiar with the term human trafficking. Trafficking actually means the transportation of people into slavery. So the sort of crossing of state or local or national borders for the purposes of sort of recruiting and then transporting somebody into a situation of enslavement. Only 10% though of the world's slaves have even been trafficked. Most of the world's slaves are just enslaved where they stand. Whole villages in India, for example, enslaved in stone quarry mining or in carpet loom labour. But I think partly because we're uncomfortable with the word slavery and we prefer the word trafficking, what this has led to is actually great public awareness about things like sex trafficking. But even the sex part is something that people are focusing on, and it isn't really a reality for more than about 10%. Again, the rest of the world's slaves are in forms of forced labour. They're in factories and on farms and fishing and in mines and quarries. There might be elements of sexual abuse there, but they're not being used for sort of forced prostitution. Independently of the details about ownership versus just sort of holding someone, about race versus vulnerability, if you just take the central core fact of someone being forced to labour against their will, we can actually sort of expand our definition and recognise these 27 million people around the world.